Hello, fellow teachers, and welcome to Teaching with Power. This is Ben Wilcox, and I'm very grateful that you've decided to spend this time with me today. This week, we are going to be finishing up the book of Acts, Acts chapters 22 through 28, the final historical chapters of the New Testament. And as I always say every week, if you are a teacher and you have any interest in using the resources that I create for teachers, just go to teachingwithpower.com and you'll find links to those resources. Now, if you're ready, grab your scriptures and your marking pencils. It's time to dig deep. For the icebreaker to begin this week, a hero quiz. Now, the concept of heroes or superheroes has been around since the dawn of time and now has become a staple of our modern movies. Heroes are individuals who are blessed with special powers that they use to help or protect their fellow man. Well, how well do you know your comic heroes? And you could do this activity either by going through these one by one from the screen as a class, or you could have your students complete it individually as a handout, which I'll make available. And what this displays is a number of different superhero symbols or logos. And your job is to identify the name of the hero that it symbolizes, that it represents. So here we go. First one is Iron Man. Next, Mr. Incredible, or any of the Incredibles. Next, and this would be Captain America. Next, this is the symbol for Wonder Woman. Next, this one's a little bit tougher, but that is the symbol for the Green Lantern. Next, the Flash. Next, from one of my favorite cartoons when I was a kid, this is the symbol for the Thundercats. Or more specifically, Lion-O, the leader of the Thundercats. And then next, this would be Aquaman. And then finally, last one here, this one's a little bit tougher. This is the symbol for Doctor Strange. And hopefully you had fun with that and were at least able to name a few of those. Well, I like to use that as an introduction to our lesson. The theme is heroes. But heroes need not only exist in the fictional realm. A hero can be defined as a person who is admired for their courage, outstanding achievements, or noble qualities. Heroes can be real people. And I believe that we all have them. Individuals that we look up to and admire and aspire to be like. And at this point, you might even consider asking your students, who is one of your real-life heroes and why? Now, Joseph Smith is one of my personal heroes. From my study of his life and his accomplishments, there is so much to admire in him. And I'm sure that there are many of you out there who share my esteem for the prophet of the Restoration. But who did Joseph Smith look up to? Did he have any personal heroes? And I believe he did. There's somebody from the scriptures that pops up over and over again in the prophet's writings that seem to give him particular strength and inspiration. And I want you to see if you can figure out who it is and why he admired him so much. So to do this as a teacher, I would number off my students from 1 to 5 and assign them to look up their assigned corresponding verse and to be ready to report what they find. So number 1s are going to go to Article of Faith number 13. Number 2s, Doctrine and Covenants 127 verse 2. Number 3, Doctrine and Covenants 128 verses 13 through 16. Number 4s, you're going to compare Doctrine and Covenants 135 verse 4 with Acts chapter 24 verse 16. And look for who Joseph is quoting. And then number 5's Joseph Smith History 1, verses 24 through 25. And if you take the time to look up those references, any of those references, I'm sure that you found the answer. Who was Joseph Smith's hero? It's Paul, right? Paul from the New Testament. We're going to take a look at each of these references here. So with Article of Faith number 13, it says, "Indeed, we may say that we follow the admonition of Paul," which you find in Philippians chapter 4, verse 8. Joseph felt that the description that Paul gives there of a true disciple of Christ was fitting to include in our core statements of belief. Number 2's Doctrine and Covenants 127, verse 2. While Joseph is in hiding because of slanderous reports that are being made against him and threats on his life, he tells us that he felt it his common lot in life to suffer the perils and the envy and the wrath of man, that it had all become second nature to him, and that he felt like Paul, to glory in tribulation. So here, he's finding inspiration to go on in the face of adversity and persecution from Paul, from this scripture hero of his. Number 3, Doctrine and Covenants 128, verses 13 through 16. And here, Joseph quotes Paul to teach what Joseph calls the most glorious of all subjects belonging to the everlasting gospel, baptism for the dead. And then for number 4's, if you compare Doctrine and Covenants 135, verse 4, with Acts chapter 24, verse 16, you'll find that just before Joseph is martyred at Carthage jail, he quotes Paul in the middle of verse 4. He says that he too had a conscience void of offense towards God and towards all men, matching Paul's exact same words. So in the last moments of Joseph's life, he has Paul on his mind, and he found this connection with this New Testament apostle. And then finally, probably the most direct and powerful reference to Paul is found in Joseph Smith History, verses 24 through 25. And I saved this one for last on purpose, because it's going to lead us straight into this week's chapters in Acts. Here, Joseph compares his life experience to Paul's. Joseph saw himself in Paul. They both had had miraculous visions that changed their lives. They were both called to be special witnesses to the world, and they were both hated and persecuted for testifying of their visions. So I want you to listen to this. "However, it was nevertheless a fact that I had beheld a vision. I have thought since that I felt much like Paul when he made his defense before King Agrippa and related the account of the vision he had when he saw a light and heard a voice. But still, there were but few who believed him. Some said he was dishonest. Others said he was mad, and he was ridiculed and reviled. But all this did not destroy the reality of his vision. He had seen a vision. He knew he had. And all the persecution under heaven could not make it otherwise. And though they should persecute him unto death, yet he knew, and would know to his latest breath, that he had both seen a light and heard a voice speaking unto him. And all the world could not make him think or believe otherwise. So it was with me. I had actually seen a light, and in the midst of that light I saw two personages, and they did, in reality, speak to me. And though I was hated and persecuted for saying that I had seen a vision, yet it was true. And while they were persecuting me, reviling me, and speaking all manner of evil against me falsely for so saying, I was led to say in my heart, why persecute me for telling the truth? I have actually seen a vision. And who am I that I can withstand God? Or why does the world think to make me deny what I have actually seen? For I had seen a vision. I knew it, and I knew that God knew it, and I could not deny it. neither dared I do it. At least I knew that by so doing I would offend God and come under condemnation. And wow, can't you just feel the conviction in Joseph's writing there? He found strength in Paul's example, his scripture hero. This is a perfect example of how somebody can liken the scriptures to themselves and find help and encouragement through them. Perhaps you've had a similar experience with the scripture hero of your own. Have you ever had a time when you were studying the life of some scripture personality which caused you to say, like Joseph, "So it was with me," and found inspiration? No wonder we're encouraged to study the scriptures every day. And what was it that Joseph so admired in Paul? Now we're going to do a little shift here. We're going to shift our focus to his superpower, so to speak, his gift. What would you say that was? I would say that it was his ability to testify with conviction and power. And do you ever wish that you could have that power? Would you like to be able to testify with boldness, conviction, and sincerity? Paul's going to show us how to do that here today. In these final chapters of Acts, we get the opportunity to see and hear Paul testify a number of different times to different people. Allow me to give you a brief overview or summary of what happens in these chapters first. If you remember last week in Acts chapter 21, Paul is being beaten by the Jews at the temple in Jerusalem when Roman soldiers pull him from the crowd to put him into the castle. But Paul requests to speak to the people who have just violently attacked him, and he testifies to them of his vision on the road to Damascus in Acts chapter 22. The majority of the people are not impressed, and they demand his execution. So the soldiers take him into the castle to bind him and scourge him, to which Paul basically says, you realize I'm a Roman citizen, right? You feel that it's okay to do this without due process of law? And this is a place where Paul's Roman citizenship really comes in handy. The chief captain unties him and allows there to be a trial of sorts. But from this point on, Paul is going to be in Roman custody for the rest of his life. He'll never be a completely free man again. And to make a long story short, in the succeeding chapters, from Acts chapter 23 to 26, we watch Paul defend himself and testify first to the Sanhedrin, the Jewish leadership, then before the Roman governor, Felix, in Caesarea, and then the new governor, Festus, and then before King Herod Agrippa. And for years, Paul is passed from one jurisdiction to another, while the Jews consistently plot against him, slander him, and encourage his execution. And during one of those trials, Paul appeals to Caesar, which is his right as a Roman citizen, and the governor agrees to send him to Rome. So chapters 27 through 28 describe the account of Paul's journey by ship to Rome, which is a really great story. We'll look at it later. And then the book of Acts ends with Paul under house arrest in Rome, awaiting his trial before Caesar. And the last verse of Acts is so fitting. Let's take a quick look at that. What is the last description we have of Paul? Preaching the kingdom of God and teaching those things which concern the Lord Jesus Christ with all confidence, no man forbidding you. What a way to end the historical books of the New Testament, with Paul doing what he loves most, testifying of Christ. Well, what was it that gave Paul his confidence to testify with such conviction and power to anybody, even the most powerful men of his day? That's our big overarching question here. There are a number of verses from this week's chapters that we're going to take a closer look at to help us answer that question. Now, if your students remember the number that they were assigned earlier from 1 to 5, just use those same numbers again to give everybody another scripture search assignment. And each assignment here is accompanied by a guiding question to help them to interpret the verse. Now, as a teacher, once they've been given a chance to study and understand their verses, I either call on specific class members to share, or I ask for volunteers. Let's go through them. Number 1, Acts 23, verse 11. And the question here is, how do you cheer up Paul? And it says, "And the night following, the Lord stood by him and said, Be of good cheer, Paul, for as thou hast testified of me in Jerusalem, so must thou bear witness also at Rome." So how do you cheer him up? You give him another chance to testify. He's apparently feeling a little dejected at this point, and the Lord knows exactly what's going to make him happy. So how do we gain more confidence in testifying of Christ? Find joy in the testifying, not necessarily whether people accept your testimony or not. Even when we're rejected, we can still find happiness and satisfaction in the effort. And I personally found this to be true. I remember finally getting up the courage to invite my neighbor to attend church with our family. He said no, but as I walked away from that interaction, the Lord filled my heart with peace and joy because I had made the effort. Many people rejected Paul, but that didn't matter. He just gloried in the privilege of being able to be a witness of Jesus Christ. Paul was outcome independent, and that can help us too, to testify with more power. And the Lord will bless us with joy in the testifying. Number 2, Acts 24:16. What gave Paul confidence to testify with power here? He says, "And herein do I exercise myself to have always a conscience void of offense towards God and toward men." What gave him power? His personal righteousness. He strove to do what was right and to follow the 2 great commandments: love God and love your fellow man. Paul was no hypocrite. He lived what he preached. And I believe that we'll have more confidence and power in our testimony if we strive to live what we teach and to have a conscience void of offense. Of course, nobody can live the gospel perfectly, and I don't believe that we have to have a Christ-like attribute mastered before we're qualified to teach it to others. But we should be striving for it and be committed to it. Hypocrisy undermines our power, while steadfastness strengthens. Number 3, Acts 26:22. Was Paul alone in his efforts to testify? "Having therefore obtained help of God, I continue unto this day, witnessing both to small and great, saying none other things than those which the prophets and Moses did say should come." And so here we learn that Paul obtained help from God. Maybe something that will help us to testify with confidence and power is to realize that we don't have to do it alone. If we put our trust in God, He'll help us. I know that before I served my mission, I was very introverted and shy. And the thought of going out and talking to strangers about my faith absolutely terrified me. But I wanted to please my Father in heaven, and I wanted to serve to the best of my ability. And I know for a fact that I did not do it on my own. I obtained help of God, like Paul did. And I feel that I was able to confidently witness because of that. And there's another phrase that your students might key off of here as well. Paul only taught those things which were taught by the prophets in the scriptures. And that can give us power too. We don't teach our own opinions and philosophies. We stick to the scriptures and the words of the living prophets. Now, number 4's had a bit of a bigger assignment. But they're instructed to just skim through Acts 22, 6 through 11, and Acts 26, 13 through 19. The question is, what experience does Paul always share when he testifies of Christ? And the answer is his personal experience with the Savior. Paul always got down to a personal level. You can see that both here in Acts chapter 26 and also back in Acts chapter 22. He shared his experience with Christ. There's great power in sharing your own personal witness of the gospel. What happened to you to lead you to believe what you do? Everybody's story is different. Everybody has their own road to Damascus. You want to testify with power? Share yours. No matter how simple or undramatic it seems, that experience has potency and force. Number 5, Acts 26:26. How do you think the last line of this verse gives Paul confidence? What's the last line of verse 26? This thing was not done in a corner. Such a great line. How does this help give Paul conviction and power? Paul sees himself as part of something much bigger than himself. The events that have preceded his testimony lend credence and foundation to his words. We've got the same blessing. The restoration of the gospel, the revelations of the prophet Joseph Smith, the translation of the Book of Mormon, our pioneer heritage, the collective wisdom and teaching of every prophet from Joseph Smith to Russell M. Nelson, the establishment of the church in all the world, millions of members, thousands of missionaries, hundreds of temples. This thing was not done in a corner. We're part of something amazing, miraculous, inspired. That realization should help us to testify with more confidence. We've got a lot of weight behind our words. There's momentum in the story of the restoration of this church. Do you remember one of the great symbols for the church in the latter days? It's a rolling stone, a stone that just gets bigger and bigger as it rolls forth. We can find strength in that knowledge that's exactly what is happening. The church is rolling forth and growing at a tremendous pace. This thing was not done in a corner. There's one final set of verses that I might add myself as a teacher once the above verses have been shared. It contains an insight that may be a little more difficult to interpret without some background knowledge. And so I take my students to Acts 26, verses 27 through 29, and I ask, who does Paul try to convert here? And what does that teach you? Let's read those verses. This is after Paul has shared his witness, his experience, and his testimony. And he looks right at King Agrippa and says, King Agrippa, believest thou the prophets? I know that thou believest. Then Agrippa said unto Paul, almost thou persuadest me to be a Christian. And Paul said, I would to God that not only thou, but also all that hear me this day were both almost and altogether such as I am, except these bonds. That little exchange is so great. Paul is so dauntless and confident that even in chains, even before the king, he's going to try and make a potential convert out of Agrippa. And I hope I don't burst anybody's bubble here, but that phrase that the king says, almost thou persuadest me to be a Christian, doesn't mean that King Agrippa is almost convinced to be a Christian. It's not that he's saying, Paul, your preaching is so powerful that I think I'm about to join your church. Just about. More than likely, this isn't the case. In the original Greek translation, it comes across more as, Paul, are you trying to convert me? Or you think that in such a short amount of time you can persuade me to be a Christian? Almost thou persuadest me? And that may be a little disappointing to some to read it that way. But I think that makes Paul's answer even better, even more powerful in a way. When he responds with, I would to God that not only thou, but also all that hear me this day were both almost and altogether such as I am. Except these bonds, minus the chains. It's as if he's saying, yes, King Agrippa, even you. Nobody is above or beneath the gospel of Jesus Christ. I want all people to be like me and have my faith and know what I know, whether high or low. So what helps Paul to teach with such confidence? He sees everybody as a potential convert. Like we talked about in the last video, Paul is willing to be a witness to all people. Now, speaking of all together, what have we all together learned from these final chapters about testifying with power? If I wish to testify with the power and confidence of Paul, I can find joy in the act of testifying, strive to have a conscience void of offense to God and my fellow man, put my trust in God and know that He will help me, share my personal faith-building experiences, remember I am a part of something bigger than myself, and see everybody as a potential convert. To liken the scriptures, when have you felt the power of either bearing testimony or hearing testimony? Please share. And which one of these truths has most inspired you today, and why? Or which one do you need to implement most? Well, may we all, just like Joseph Smith, find inspiration and strength in the example of Paul. He can be our hero, too. This testifying superpower that he had is an attainable ability. It's not just something that comes because you're born on Krypton or you get bitten by a radioactive spider. This power to testify can be developed, cultivated, and practiced. And the things that Paul has shown us today, here by example, can provide us with a roadmap to that power. We, too, can become holy heroes. We can seek to do the things that he did and internalize the principles that he understood. And if we do, I believe that we'll receive the power to testify like he testified. It worked for Joseph Smith. It can work for us too. Now there's a brief principle that I'd like to highlight based on those last verses that we studied in the previous lesson there, specifically verse 29. There's another powerful principle there. And here's a brief way of teaching that principle. For an icebreaker, I like to ask this question: is 99.9% good enough? And let them share. And I'm sure that in some areas, it certainly is. Getting 99.9% on a test is a great score. Being in the 99th percentile in your profession would be an indicator that you're doing very well. However, there are some areas where even 99.9% would not be acceptable. Areas where almost is not good enough. Because if 99.9% is good enough, then 22,000 checks will be deducted from the wrong bank accounts in the next 60 minutes. 1,314 phone calls will be misplaced by telecommunication services every minute. 2 plane landings daily at O'Hare International Airport in Chicago will be unsafe. 20,000 incorrect drug prescriptions will be written in the next 12 months. 107 incorrect medical procedures will be performed by the end of the day today. 315 entries in Webster's Dictionary of the English language will turn out to be misspelled. And 12 babies will be given to the wrong parents each day. So as you can see, there are things where almost is not enough. Maybe you've heard the well-known proverb, close only counts in horseshoes and hand grenades. Well, there's another area where we should consider this advice, and that's in our identity as Christians and in our commitment to following the commandments. There's a different word that I would hope we could use to describe our identity and commitment. And it's a word that Paul uses in Acts 26, verse 29, as he stands before King Agrippa. This is where Agrippa says, almost thou persuadest me to be a Christian. Paul's response is brilliant. We don't want to be almost Christians. We want another word to describe us. And what word would that be? And Paul said, I would to God that not only thou, but also all that hear me this day were both almost and altogether such as I am. Except these bonds. The word is altogether. We want to be altogether Christians, not almost. Paul wants everybody to be like him, almost and altogether like him. What's that referring to? He wishes that everybody could have the conviction of Christ that he did, to understand what Paul did, to receive the blessings that he had received. He didn't want anybody to be chained as he is, but to have his testimony, his witness, his commitment, and his blessings. So if we want to liken the scriptures here, when it comes to our commitment to following the commandments, which word would you use to describe it? Would you answer these questions with an almost or an altogether? Do you study the scriptures? Almost or altogether? Do you keep the Sabbath day holy? Do you seek to serve others? Are you kind to your fellow man? Do you strive to live your covenants? Now, what if we have to answer those questions with an almost over and over again? I almost studied my scriptures today. I intended to. I know it's important. I have them sitting there next to my bed. But day after day, I just almost get around to doing it. Or I almost decided to serve that person. I thought about it. I almost jumped in to do something, but didn't quite follow through. I almost did this. I almost did that. And here's the scary thing. I'm afraid that if we get to the final judgment and we look back on the majority of our lives and all we can answer to those kinds of questions is a hesitant almost, then when we gather up the courage to ask, so did I make it into thy kingdom, Lord? He might sadly look at us and say, almost. And so the truth that could be shared with this might be, if I almost live the gospel of Christ, I will almost receive the blessings. But if I altogether live the gospel of Jesus Christ, I will altogether receive the blessings. And I want to recognize that we do need to be careful when we teach principles like this. The purpose is not a guilt trip. You may want to qualify those statements by reminding them that we're not talking about perfection here. We all fall short of the mark. We all need the grace of Christ. As you've heard me say in many previous lessons, our desires to do what's right do count for something with our Lord. The hunger and thirst that we feel for righteousness will be considered at the judgment. The road to heaven is also paved with good intentions. However, sometimes it's important to take a hard look at ourselves and consider this more sobering message as well. Are we being lured into a almost sense of obedience? What's the minimum? Pick and choose the commandments you want to live. Lazy approach to living the gospel. Let's be altogether disciples, not just almost disciples. Let's all together study our scriptures and serve others and keep the Sabbath day holy and strive to keep our covenants. Almost and altogether, as Paul. And if we do, then God will altogether bless us and welcome us into his kingdom. Now, I just love Acts chapter 27. It is so powerful and so relevant, and the lesson that it teaches is especially effective with the youth, but a wonderful message for everybody. And the icebreaker I like to use for this chapter is a story that was told by Elder Spencer J. Condie in General Conference of 1993. And he relates the following. In January of 1975, on a dark, rainy night in Tasmania, a 7,300-ton barge smashed into two piers of the Tasman Bridge, which connects Hobart, Tasmania, with its eastern suburbs across the bay. 3 spans of the bridge collapsed. An Australian family by the name of Ling were driving across the bridge when suddenly the bridge lights went out. Just then a speeding car passed them and disappeared before their very eyes. Murray Ling slammed on his brakes and skidded to a stop, 1 yard from the edge of a black void. Murray got his family out of the car and then began warning oncoming traffic of the disaster ahead. As he frantically waved his arms, to his horror, a car swerved around him and plummeted into the abyss. A second car barely stopped in time, but a third car showed no sign of slowing down and crashed into the Ling's car at the edge of the bridge. Suddenly, a loaded bus headed toward Murray, ignoring his waving arms. In desperation, risking his very life, he ran alongside the driver's window. "There's a span missing," he yelled. The bus swerved just in time and came to a halt against the railing. Dozens of lives had been saved. Now, can you imagine what it would have been like to be that man in that situation? To know that certain disaster lay ahead, and all you can do is wave your arms and hope that people will listen to you. And how must that have felt to have watched that car ignore his warning, swerve around him, and continue anyway? Or the relief he must have felt when that bus finally decided to listen to him and stop. Like that man, I believe that there are people in our day who have been given a special foreknowledge of coming dangers, that have been sent by a loving Heavenly Father to warn and help us. And when their warnings are ignored, disaster always follows. But when they're heeded, safety and happiness are the results. The story we find in Acts chapter 27 begins with a warning. Paul is going to give a very specific warning to the people that he's traveling with on his way to Rome. Do you remember that? He's appealed to Caesar for trial, and now he's being transported from Caesarea by ship all the way to Rome. Now, at this point in the journey, where we're going to pick up the story, they've already sailed to the island of Crete in the middle of the Mediterranean, and they're docked there at a place called the Fair Havens. But the sailing season is nearing its end, and the centurion who's in charge of Paul has a decision to make. There's a different port that they'd rather go to stay for the winter. But this is where Paul steps in and issues his warning. And can you find it? What's his warning in verses 9 through 10? Now, when much time was spent, and when sailing was now dangerous, because the fast was now already past, Paul admonished them, and said unto them, Sirs, I perceive that this voyage will be with hurt and much damage, not only of the lading and ship, but also of our lives. The warning is that Paul says that they should not continue their journey at this time, that they should stay in that location until the dangerous winter sailing season is over. They've got an issue here. Should they stay or should they go? Paul is saying no, while others on the ship are saying yes. And I want you to put yourself into the shoes of the Roman centurion in charge that has to make that decision. Let's say you're that centurion, and you've got these two sides pulling on you, these differing opinions. Which would you follow? And let's take a closer look at these two sides. And let's begin with the reasons not to follow Paul. What arguments do the let's go crowd have for ignoring Paul and pulling away from the shore? I want you to look for those reasons. Find all the justifications not to listen to Paul in verses 11 through 13, because I see at least 5. How many can you find? Here's what I see. In 27:11, here's a reason not to listen to Paul. The master of the ship disagrees with Paul. He's part of the let's go crowd. Now, in that situation, who are you going to trust? The guy who's been sailing his whole life? The man that owns the ship and is called the master of the ship? Do you remember Paul's occupation? He was a tent maker. Does he have any right to call into question the decisions or the opinion of the master of the ship? Now, that's a good question. So that's one reason to ignore Paul. He's not a master of sailing. Verse 12, it was not a commodious place to winter in, which means it's not a very convenient place to stay. The Fair Havens apparently wasn't the best port to stay in for a long-term period of time in the eyes of the captain and the people of the ship. Maybe it didn't have as many restaurants or bowling alleys or whatnot. They wanted to go to a different place. Also in verse 12, the more part disagreed. That means that the majority of the people on the ship thought that it was a good idea to go. And then another one in verse 12 that may not be as obvious, and you might need to help them on this one a little bit. They need to be looking at a map of the Mediterranean. And remember, and you can see it there in verse 8, they're in a place called the Fair Havens. It's right here on the island of Crete on this map. But where do they want to go? Verse 12 tells us they want to go to Phoenice or Phoenix because it's a better place to stay for the winter. Which is kind of funny because in the United States, Phoenix is a good place to spend the winter too. But look how close it is. It's just a tiny little ways around the coast. And you can almost hear the people on the ship saying, Paul, look, it's not like we're trying to go this huge distance. It's just around the island a ways. It's not a big deal. What are you so worried about? So another reason to ignore Paul is because it doesn't seem like there is a big risk. You could pair that with another phrase in verse 13, which tells us that they are sailing close to Crete. So they're not going to go too far from the safety of the island. They're just going to pull away from the shore, sail a little distance, and then they'll be in this better place. What's the risk? And then there's one more in verse 13. The wind was blowing softly. I'm sure that as they pulled away from the shore, that many of the people on the ship could have walked over to Paul and said, see, what were you so worried about? That's our final reason to ignore Paul. All the conditions seemed advantageous. Lots of great reason to ignore the tent maker and listen to the master and the more part of the people. However, can you think of any good reasons now to listen to Paul? Does he have anything going for him? I believe there is. There is one excellent, compelling, and formidable reason to listen to him. And what is it? He's a prophet, right? That's quite the credential. And in that light, all the excuses and all the reasons for not listening to him go out the window. But they don't listen to him. That's not enough for them. All those other reasons take precedence. And so they leave. And what happens as soon as they leave? You can read Acts 27:14-21. But not long after, there arose against it a tempestuous wind called Euroclydon. And when the ship was caught and could not bear up into the wind, we let her drive. So almost as soon as they pull away from the shore, they get caught in this storm, and they are out of control. They lose control of the ship. So what I would encourage my students to do is to look through verses 14-21 and mark all the consequences that they suffer because they didn't listen to Paul. And I'll begin with one that's back in verse 10. Paul's initial warning, he says that there will be hurt and much damage. But now you look for the ones in 14-21. In verse 14, tempestuous winds. In 15, they were caught and could not bear up into the wind. Verse 16, much work. 17, fear of the quicksands. And they were driven, which means they were out of control. They no longer had control of the ship. 18, exceedingly tossed with a tempest. Verse 20, there's a bunch of them here. No sun or stars to guide them many days. No small tempest lay on us. All hope was taken away. And then in verse 21, harm and loss. What truth, then, is this story teaching us? How would you complete the following principle? If I ignore the warnings of the prophet, then what? And give them an opportunity to fill in that blank. They could finish it in any number of ways. Here are some possible ones. If I ignore the warnings of the prophet, then storms will come and knock me off course. If I ignore the warnings of the prophet, then it will bring hurt, much damage, harm, and loss. If I ignore the warnings of the prophets, then I may be lost and lose hope. And if there was one key phrase from the scriptures that summarizes that principle, I would mark this one in verse 21, when Paul says, Sirs, ye should have hearkened unto me, and not have loosed from Crete, and to have gained this harm and loss. That's what happens when we fail to hearken to the prophets of God. Now we want to take some time to really deeply liken the scriptures. And I like to do this with a pondering handout. Invite them to ponder each of the reasons that we found in verses 11-13 and ask themselves, how do people today use some of the same reasons to ignore the prophet's warnings now? And give them plenty of time to think. They don't need to feel like they have to fill in every single one of these, but encourage them to do their best to liken the scriptures to themselves. Here are some of my thoughts. For the masters disagree? Well, who are some of the masters of our day that disagree with the prophet's counsels? Celebrities, social media personalities, scholars, so-called experts, those with master's degrees in something? Sometimes these individuals promote ideas that are contrary to the words of the prophets. Some possible examples. A nutritionist might come out and say, a cup of coffee or a glass of wine a day is actually good for you. And they're a nutritionist, and this is a master speaking. But the prophet says something different. Keep the word of wisdom. And people may rationalize and they say, yeah, but what does the prophet know about that? He's not a trained nutritionist. What qualifications does he have to tell me otherwise? He's just a tent maker. What about the master of the ship? Some financial advisor may come out and say, don't worry about saving money or paying off debt. Just invest, invest, invest. While the prophets have consistently warned us to strive to stay out of debt and to have a reserve of savings for hard times. And somebody might say, well, what business does the prophet have in giving me financial advice? What qualifications does he have? These bankers and investors have years of study and experience under their belt. Why not listen to them instead? Some social expert may come out and say that immorality and pornography are just normal human behaviors, that if everybody would just accept them and stop worrying about it so much, then it wouldn't really be much of a problem. So, do the prophets have the right to claim precedence over the masters? And I would say yes. Yes, they do. Just like Paul versus the master of the ship. They have one very important qualification that qualifies them to speak on matters that they may not have a background in. They're prophets. They speak the mind and the will of God, who knows all. We've got to learn to trust the tent maker over the master. The second reason, it was not commodious. Are there commandments and counsels that are not commodious or convenient to live? I think that we're all going to experience times in our lives where it would probably be much more convenient not to be a member of the church. Paying tithing in a time of financial stress may not be convenient. Being the only one in the workplace not going out for drinks after work may not be convenient for us. Being honest and failing the test may not be as convenient as copying the paper of the person next to you and passing. Standing out like a sore thumb amongst your peers that all use foul language while you don't may not be convenient. Trying to find modest clothing in today's marketplace may not be convenient. Keeping the commandments is oftentimes not commodious. In the short term, right? Even though the Fair Havens was not as commodious a place to stay as Phoenix was, it was certainly a lot better than finding yourself in the midst of a storm, out of control. I believe that when we ignore the prophet's counsels, they always eventually lead to storms in the long term. Reason number 3, the more part disagrees. And that's a common rationalization. What are the more part or majority of the people saying about an issue? What are the majority of the people around me doing? It's hard to go against the grain of the more part. Everybody else is doing it is a common youth justification. But adults can be just as bad. Are we tempted to go to social media for our opinions? How does the majority feel about premarital sex? How does the majority feel about the issue of gay marriage? What movies and music and video games are the majority of people engaging in? The lure of the mainstream and the popular can be a very tough current to resist. Reason number 4, it doesn't seem like a big deal, or that you're traveling very far from the safety of the commandments' shore. Have you ever caught yourself rationalizing your actions with that one? Oh, it's not that big a deal to push the boundaries a little bit. It's not like I'm stepping way out of line. A teenager might say something like, it's not like I'm going to ruin my life by having a serious relationship in my youth. Or an adult might say, just a little gambling isn't going to hurt me much. I'll just do it a couple times a year. What's the harm in that? Or, so I lose my temper now and then. It's just the way I am. Or, well, if I abuse these pain pills or have a drink of alcohol now and then, I'll be okay. I can stop whenever I want. And when we make those kinds of rationalizations, we push a little past the fence of the Prophet's counsel and comfort ourselves by saying that we're only compromising a little and that we are still in control. Unfortunately, when we loose from the safe shores of the Prophet's warnings, we immediately place ourselves into dangerous waters. I really love the name of the place that they're staying, the Fair Havens. Even the name of that place suggests safety, comfort, and beauty. We too should stay in the fair havens of the Prophet's counsel, even when it's not as commodious. And then our final reason, the south wind blew softly, or all conditions seem advantageous. We too may look out at the sea of human experience and say, everything looks okay for me to proceed. We could say, well, I know a guy who did this and this in their youth, and they still served a mission, and they fixed things later, and they were okay, so can I. Or, I know this person who drank and smoked their whole life, and they lived to be 90. I should be okay too. Or, I feel it would actually be better for my family if we didn't attend church on Sunday. We'll spend that time together and build our relationships. How can that be better? However, I don't think we're always the best judges of the conditions around us. Better to be humble and trust the prophets who have a greater perspective than we do. They can see the span of the bridge that's missing in our plans. And now, one final question at the bottom of the handout. Without naming names, can you think of any real-life examples of somebody who ignored the warnings of the prophets and it brought them harm and loss? I mean, is there any evidence that our principle here is true? Personally, I can think of many examples from my own life and the lives of people I know. I can think of a young woman that I taught years ago who ignored the prophet's counsels on morality and became too serious with a boyfriend too young. She felt it was no big deal and that nothing bad could ever come of her relationship. She got pregnant at age 16, and then the boy wanted nothing to do with her after that. I know of a man who allowed pornography to slowly overcome his life until he lost his job over it, and then his family. I know of an individual who allowed the opinions of the masters and the more part to convince them that the church was getting its social policies all wrong. And now they've left the fair havens of church membership. I know of a good friend who, after graduating from high school, decided to attend some wild parties, justifying that he would be able to handle the temptations there, that he would stay close to shore and not travel too far off. Unfortunately, it wasn't long before he too found himself participating in the drinking and the drugs and the immorality. The pull of the tempestuous winds proved to be too strong for his ship, and he couldn't bear up under it. He lost control of his ship. And then, in my own life, I've definitely experienced harm and loss when I've ignored or fudged on keeping the commandments more than I care to admit. And I sometimes like to point out a phrase in verse 14 by asking how long it took for things to get bad on the ship. And it says, not long after. It oftentimes doesn't take very long for things to go bad when we leave the safety of the prophet's warnings. Almost as soon as they pull away from the shore, the wind really picks up, and before they know it, they're at the mercy of the sea. So may I pause from the story for a minute and just bear witness to you that I know that you can trust the prophets. They are men of God and will never lead you astray. trust the tent makers more than even the masters and the more part. When they wave their arms to warn us of the dangers ahead, I pray that we'll heed them. Like we used to sing in primary, follow the prophet, follow the prophet, follow the prophet, don't go astray. Follow the prophet, follow the prophet, follow the prophet. He knows the way. And as we do that, may we always enjoy the safety of the fair havens of the commandments and counsels of God, as incommodious as they may seem at times. And then may our storms and shipwrecks be few, and the harm and the loss that accompanies them avoided. And that point is where I would want to spend a majority of my time on a lesson in Acts 27. But you don't want to finish quite there. I would be sure to at least summarize the rest of the story. It's always better if you can end on a positive note. And this story does have a happy ending and an additional principle and message of hope for us. So take them to verse 21 again and remind them of Paul's words. Sirs, you should have listened to me. But he doesn't stop there. Continue on into verses 22 through 25. Paul says that there is still reason to hope. And we too have reason to hope, even if we do find ourselves in the midst of the storms of the consequences of our poor decisions. He says, and now I exhort you to be of good cheer, for there shall be no loss of any man's life among you, but of the ship. For there stood by me this night the angel of God, whose I am, and whom I serve, saying, Fear not, Paul, thou must be brought before Caesar, and lo, God hath given thee all of them that sail with thee. Wherefore, sirs, be of good cheer, for I believe God, that it shall be even as it was told me. So he calms their fears, and he says, yes, we're going to lose the ship. However, if you'll start listening to me, nobody's going to die. We will all get to shore safely. And as the story continues, there's one more test for these sailors. After a long time in the storm, they sight land. But now they're worried about being driven into the rocks. So the shipmen are about to abandon the boat in a lifeboat and leave the rest of the passengers to fend for themselves. So Paul says to the centurion with him at verse 31, except these abide in the ship, ye cannot be saved. Which, if you think about it, is another really challenging instruction from Paul, the tent maker. Cut off the lifeboat and stay in the ship. And they got a decision to make. Do I follow the prophet or the master and the more part? And thankfully, this time, they listened to Paul. They cut the lifeboat off, and he sits them all down, calms their fears, and tells them to eat a little food. Total calm in the face of a great storm and danger. And verse 36 tells us that they were all of good cheer. So in the next verses, they run the ship aground on the island of Malta, and the ship is ripped to pieces by the waves. And there are people swimming and holding onto broken pieces of the ship. But just look at the last verse in the chapter. So it came to pass that they escaped all safe to land. I really love that principle as well. There will probably be times in all of our lives where we ignore the warnings of the prophets. But the end of our story doesn't have to be all doom and gloom from there. When we find ourselves caught in the storms of our bad decisions, there is still a safe way back to land. If we've ignored the counsels of the prophets in the past, then we can start heeding them now. And as soon as we do, things will improve. And ultimately, I believe that we can eventually escape safely to shore. There is a way back, even from the midst of exceedingly tempestuous storms. And the story ends with hope. And that will conclude our story for this week. Thank you so much for spending this time with me in the scriptures. We're now finished with all of the historical books of the New Testament. And next week, we're going to dive into the epistles of Paul. So prepare yourselves. But I'm confident we're going to have an amazing time studying the words of Paul throughout the rest of this year. Thank you so much for watching. Now get out there and teach with power.